Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Our focus in the World Affairs Council is on global education, international affairs, and global communications. We're regarded as an institution where learning happens. And tonight you're going to see that philosophy in action. Venezuela, one of three countries that emerged from the collapse of Simón Bolívar's Gran Colombia in 1830. Others included Ecuador and New Granada, which morphed into Colombia. Venezuela is bordered by Colombia to the west, Brazil to the south, Guyana to the east. It's been a democracy since 1958. Its flag is made up of three horizontal stripes of yellow, blue, and red, an arc of 8 stars in the center of the middle blue band. Those stars represent the 7 provinces that supported Venezuelan independence in 1830. The 8th star was added in 2006 and represents modern-day Guyana, the province where the independence leader, Simón Bolívar, the great liberator, hailed from. Today, Venezuela has a population of over 30 million people, 96% Roman Catholic, 2% Protestant, and 2% other. Venezuela is slightly more than twice the size of California. In 1998, Venezuela elected the one, the only, Hugo Chavez as their 64th president. He was the leader and founder of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, also known for those who are dyslexic as the PSUV. Chavez was the leader and founder of the United Socialist Party. Under his executive branch, he exercised increasingly authoritarian control over all other branches of government. Chavez and his PSUV's economic policies have expanded the state's role in the economy, increased dependence on the nationalized oil industry. After Chavez's death in 2013, he was succeeded by then Vice President Nicolas Maduro. Since 1830, Venezuela had maintained a relatively close relationship with the U.S., but Chavez's presidency severely strained these ties. In 2008, Chavez accused the United States of conspiring against his government and ousted U.S. Ambassador Patrick Duddy, the center to my left. Ambassador Duddy, who is here with us tonight, strongly denies this claim. Both embassies remain open, but there are no ambassadors on post in either Washington, D.C. or Caracas in Venezuela. The U.S. government repeatedly has attempted to reopen friendly diplomatic and bilateral relations with Venezuela. In 2015, President Obama signed an executive order imposing sanctions specifically targeted at persons involved in or responsible for the erosion of human rights in Venezuela. Under President Maduro, Venezuela has seen 3 years of steep economic decline, made more acute with the fall in global oil prices. Venezuela's overdependency on its oil industry revenues has greatly hindered its economy. Its export revenue has been nearly wiped out from the drop in oil prices. The recent drop in overall national revenue due to these prices has caused the government to limit the amount of import of basic goods. This has led to severe basic commodity shortages, widespread looting, and a black market for the purchase of simple groceries. Recently, the government has also imposed rolling blackouts meant to deal with the chronic energy supply shortage. Indicators from the IMF are discouraging. They predict that the country's economy will contract by 8% this year, and inflation rates will raise over 1,000%. The Opposition Democratic Unity Roundtable, the acronym is MUD, took 2/3 majority of Congress in December 2015, but its legislative agenda has been repeatedly blocked. Maduro has jailed political opposition leaders, including Leopoldo Lopez, a successful mayor and leader of the Popular Will Party. The Organization of American States has called an emergency meeting to evaluate if Venezuela's democratic order is in danger and assess if a decision should be made to potentially suspend them or bring sanctions against the country. In a speech to the OAS last week, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry advocated for, and I quote, a fair and timely recall referendum and the release of political prisoners. As reported in the Wall Street Journal, the opposition is in the midst of a 3-year stage process that could lead to a referendum if staged this year. The recall would likely not only cut short Mr. Maduro's 6-year term, pollsters say, but also end more than 17 years of socialist rule. But if the recall is held next year, Mr. Maduro's vice president would serve out the rest of his term, ensuring the continuation of his policies. Tonight, the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s forum is focused on a discussion on the growing internal crisis in Venezuela. We have a distinguished panel here today, and I'm indebted to each of them for giving of their time to come along and share their expertise with us tonight. Dr. Michael McCarthy, a political scientist, specializes in South America and U.S. Latin American relations and is a research fellow at American University's Center for Latin American Studies. We are also honored to have Ambassador Patrick Duddy, the former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela. He is currently the director of Duke University's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. The moderator of this evening's discussion is Eric Farnsworth, Vice President of the Americas Society and Council of the Americas. I encourage you all to take full advantage of asking any questions tonight that you may have of our panelists and our moderator. And I will turn the program over now to Mr. Farnsworth.
Well, Tony, thank you very much. It's good to be here. It's good to be at the World Affairs Council. Congratulations on your leadership, and frankly, thanks for your leadership. You all have a very important mission and something that I'm personally committed to, which is the education of the American public on foreign policy issues. And it seems to me we need more of that these days than ever before. And so I congratulate you and thank you for that, as well as thanking you for putting together a program on Venezuela. I work in Washington, have for 26 years, and there just aren't that many conversations around Latin America, particularly compared to other issues. And we understand why, but organizations that intentionally try to change that paradigm a little bit, I think I'm indebted to, and I thank you for the session this afternoon. Venezuela is clearly one of the topics that needs more conversation, not less. It's a country that is on the ropes, and we're going to hear about that tonight, as well as perhaps some things that might be able to be done to help address that by Venezuelans themselves, by the international community, certainly by the United States. And we have two terrific panelists. My role today is really just to lob some very soft questions at them and let them hit it out of the park, which I will intend to do, and let them really give you a sense of Venezuela, a snapshot where it is right now, how we got to where we are, and where we may be going. Because these issues, in my personal view, are not going to get any better anytime soon. It's going to be a situation that will get worse and that will occupy an increasingly large amount of senior policymakers' time in the weeks and months to come. With that, let me ask Ambassador Duddy. I've known Patrick for a long time. We worked in the State Department together, and a good personal friend. I'm not going to ask him if he actually got kicked out of Venezuela in 2008, although he can tell me if he wants. But rather to simply set the stage for us, give us a sense. I mean, you were the last U.S. ambassador accredited to Venezuela. That was 8 years ago. What's happened? What's the snapshot today? What does the country look like? Give us a sense of where the country is now.
Well, thank you for that, Eric, and happily that is a softball question. I'm not sure I can hit it out of the park, but I'll do what I can. There are, I guess, a number of observations that I would make to begin with. The first is that as we analyze what's going on in Venezuela, it's important to understand that there are really two crises in Venezuela. There is a political crisis and there is a humanitarian crisis. And they are related, to be sure, but there are really two distinct sets of issues. This week in Washington, there is a great deal of discussion about the political dimensions of the current situation in Venezuela. The importance of respecting the Venezuelan Constitution, a possible recall, a referendum on the president, et cetera. But I think that probably for everyday Venezuelans, for most Venezuelans at every level, the problems of severe shortages of basic goods, what would be called down there the canasta básica, the basic basket of U.S. consumer goods, of individual consumer goods, and acute shortages of medical supplies, critically important medicines, but also inputs from medical procedures, and a shortage of electrical power, which has resulted not only in electricity rationing, rolling blackouts and brownouts, but until just recently, the government, in an effort to save electrical power, had actually reduced the government work week to 2 days, right? To 2 days. So there are two crises. There is a humanitarian crisis and there is a political crisis, and they are related, but there are distinct features of the two. A second point that I would make is that the economic difficulties which are affecting the country right now are more severe in Venezuela than the same trends feel or are being experienced elsewhere in the region. And this is because of the economic model that President Chavez imposed, and which was at a certain moment embraced by most Venezuelans, but which Nicolas Maduro is now trying to sustain despite the overwhelming evidence of its failure. Even when I first arrived in Venezuela in 2007, there were problems with scarcity. Right? I remember vividly officers at the American embassy trying to find milk products, powdered milk, long life milk, fresh milk. It wasn't available, or eggs, or cooking oil. Right? Even at the height of the oil boom, the Venezuelan government was having trouble keeping basic goods on the shelves. Right? So the current crisis, right, in effect reveals the flaws or the failure of the model that President Chavez brought with him into office. It is not to be either explained entirely by the fall in oil prices, or in the case of electrical power, the drought, nor will a simple resurgence in the global oil markets solve the problems that are bedeviling the Venezuelan public at the moment. So what do we have? We have a situation in which miles of supermarket shelves are effectively empty, right? According to the various groups that track these things, as many as 80%, as much as 80% of all of the basic goods that are in that basket of consumer goods are unavailable at any given time. A recent survey done by a group using as a yardstick the list of 163 basic medicines typically found in most pharmacies found that over half of them were completely unavailable and many of the rest in short supply. Right? And many of the rest in short supply. These are issues which will not go away easily or without dramatic change. Our host mentioned the extraordinary levels of inflation. But to fully understand just how bad it is, it's important to understand that last year inflation was 180%, that the year before it was 66 or 68%, and 56% the year before that. I can't remember when inflation was lower than 20% in the last decade. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine what that would do to your savings. The currency has essentially collapsed. Exports have crashed because the government basically can't pay its bills. And this is part, but only part, of what explains the problem of shortages. More than a decade of expropriations, nationalizations, various government efforts to take over the non-oil productive sectors of the economy that the government didn't already control have manifestly failed across the board. Virtually nothing the government has touched has prospered. Right?
Patrick, I'm going to come to Michael in just a minute, but let me pick up on that with a drill down, no pun intended, in terms of the energy sector. Look, about 3 years ago, oil was at 120 a barrel. It collapsed to 29, at least for Venezuelan crude. Now it's back up to, for Venezuelan, it's 40, global market's 40. About 50, but it's recovering slowly. So does this change your analysis going forward in terms of...
Those numbers are correct, but it's important to understand that only a few weeks ago, PDVSA, the national oil company, reported to OPEC that its national production had fallen by 120,000 barrels a day. They're now producing substantially less oil today than when President Chavez entered office. And this notwithstanding the fact that they have the world's largest proven and probable reserves. You know, a position acknowledged by even Saudi Arabia.
And you would anticipate that as prices go up, production would actually increase if it were a working economy.
Listen, Saudi Arabia can cope with a decline in revenue calculated by the barrel by simply opening the spigot, right? Pump more. Venezuela has, for a very long time, been producing at close to its maximum capacity. Right? They have not been able to compensate for the fall in price, but because their capability of producing more has actually eroded during the years that President Chavez and President Maduro have been in office. And now things have become even worse as their supply of light sweet crude, which they need to mix with the heavy sour, which now constitutes the bulk of their production, that supply has declined. And so they now have had to purchase light sweet on the global market and bring it into Venezuela to mix with local production.
It's daunting. Thank you for that. We'll come back to follow up a couple of those topics. Michael, let's go to you. Michael is a true expert on Venezuela, and we're delighted to have him as well. You know, Patrick laid out a pretty gruesome scenario. That's not a technical term, that's my term. Feel free to disagree with that. But in the context of, assuming you agree with the scenario as Patrick laid out, how did we get to where we are? I mean, you know, a couple of years ago, people were saying that the Chavista model was a model for Latin America, and we had all kinds of people following it and speaking in favorably of it, and Hollywood celebrities going down and this and that. What happened? I mean, give us a sense of, you know, how do we get to where we are today from where we used to be?
Great question, Eric. Let me start by saying thank you to the World Affairs Council for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Ambassador Duddy in particular. I carried out research for my dissertation as a Fulbright scholar while he was in fact the ambassador. So, this is a long time coming, being on a panel together one way or another.
Now you can get them back, right?
No. The embassy was great to me, and it was really a great experience. And, in the same vein of, promoting education and world affairs, the Fulbright is a great mechanism and tool that we have in the U.S. government. I think there are two parts to your question, Eric, and I'll start with the question of how we got here, and then the second one of sort of the regional implications or coalitions, if you will, around the Chavez model. First, I essentially agree with everything that Ambassador Duddy has said about the major flaws in the sort of Bolivarian economic model being in place already, and that it was an extremely high-risk model, extremely dependent on high petroleum prices. And it was dependent on those high petroleum prices to maintain macro imbalances, not to do much else beyond that. And it was an economic model driven by political interests to a great extent. And so the reason so many people have been discussing problems associated with the plummet in oil prices that began at the end of 2014 is because that began to immediately erode support for the government. It's not so much that oil explains everything about Venezuela's crisis, but it was a game changer in terms of the popularity of the Maduro government. And on the oil question, I think it was a great point that they've had these production problems for a long time. In fact, from 2006 to 2012, while Chavez was still in power, the production dropped from 3 million barrels a day to 2.5. And there's a chance that this year it drops all the way down to 2.1 in a year in which they really need to be, picking up their production to be sort of picking up the slack.
It was at 2.37 a couple of weeks ago.
There you go. Okay. So I mean, these problems are structural. They've been there for a long time. And if I had to, sort of sum it up, I would say that Chavez left the country in a situation of permanent crisis, and Maduro has been an utter failure at crisis management. And his failure at crisis management has brought the country to the doorstep of a collapse. I think that, we can go back and forth about what terms to use here. I tend to be more of a splitter rather than a lumper. So I think that Venezuela is something like a critically weak state that has the possibility of becoming a failed state, but I'm not ready to call it a failed state yet. And I think that the humanitarian angle and set of issues associated with that are really what's driving the day-to-day life of the country. In the same vein, they're affecting the way that international actors are trying to engage in the problems that Venezuela is facing. We can come back to this when we just discuss the international context, but it's shaping to some extent the preferences, I think, from international stakeholders about whether or not stability is more important than democracy. And I want to leave that out there for a slightly provocative thought to come back at some point. Now, the question of regional support for the Bolivarian model, leaving aside the Sean Penn question and Naomi Campbell question, I think really here that in a lot of ways, most of the left in Latin America was very happy to let Hugo Chavez provide their radical cover to the left. That is to say, let Chavez be the one leading the anti-American protests at Mar del Plata and Buenos Aires. And we're just going to do our own thing. And at a rhetorical level, we will support Bolivarianism, this supposed ideology created by the Chavismo, by the Chavistas. But in practice, we're going to do what's best for our own interests. When you look at countries that are often lumped into the same group as the sort of ALBA Bolivarians, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, their economic models are much different than the Venezuelan economic model in the sense that they have a private sector model that allows for there to be growth and involvement in private sector capital development. And I think in a lot of ways, there was sort of a learning process, which is to say, Chavez brought a lot of problems on himself by trying to move in a very radical, hyper-statist fashion, and others who were sort of second movers who came to power after him in this left or pink tide could essentially say, well, maybe that's really not the best path for us to take in that regard. So I think that really the collapse of the sort of the debacle in Venezuela and the potential collapse of Chavismo tell us two things about the broader story of the left in Latin America. One, that the authoritarian turn of the government went unchecked. And that is very, very deplorable and very, very disappointing. But secondarily, in terms of the radical nature of the economic model, it isn't so easy to paint with a broad brush and say that it was all the same thing in that regard.
You mean regionally?
Yes, I mean regionally. Yeah,
Right.
I mean not within Venezuela. I mean,
Right, okay.
I mean Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, which are countries that have many problems on the democracy front, but they've managed, a much different sort of economic, much different set of economic problems in a way that I think has to do with national interest more than ideology.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing us to the current moment. Some very provocative ideas there, some very well-stated thoughts, lots to follow up on. Let me come back to Patrick then. As ambassador in any country, ambassadors are tasked with promoting U.S. national interests. That's a particularly tough thing to do in Venezuela in a Chavista regime. And I'd just like to give you, for you to give us a sense of what was it like to be ambassador there during that time? And the reason why I'm asking this is very relevant to, I think, the question that I'm going to ask Michael to follow up, which will be, what can we do now, if anything? In other words, what tools are available to the U.S. and to the international community to help address what I agree with is a developing humanitarian crisis, a gathering crisis, and what are the tools available to help try to forestall that? As ambassador, in a very circumscribed scenario, there's some things that can be done and some things that frankly can't. Help us think that through.
An important sort of reality that I and my most senior colleague, Phil French, who's in the audience, had to deal with when we were there, was that anti-Americanism was a permanent feature of President Chavez's dialogue, not only with the region, but also with the Venezuelan public. Right? As he began long before President Maduro, who frequently ascribes the source of his many difficulties to the United States, long before President Maduro took office, it was commonplace for President Chavez to blame the United States for Venezuela's difficulties. And certainly I had the strong sense, as I traveled around the country, that the government wished to minimize any sort of dialogue I was able to have with the Venezuelan people. And so in a number of cities, I recall showing up to, say, inaugurate a book donation or a reading room and that sort of thing, and having President Chavez's lieutenants in the area, whether they were elected officials or party officials, leading demonstrations against my very presence in the city. And in 2 or 3 states, including in my very last trip to the interior, Chavista governors would actually go on the radio and call for demonstrations to protest my presence in the city. And to try and block my access to, say, university audiences or other public sites. So it was a very, very difficult relationship. At the same time, there were moments, July 5th, 2008 was one, where President Chavez would occasionally make gestures to the United States. He made one that day to me in public, as I was I was attending a public event with other members of the diplomatic community. At the conclusion of the event, in front of those other diplomats, he called me over and said, perhaps we really should restart conversations on a variety of issues. I said, certainly, and we will follow up. We're very interested in doing that. But our efforts to follow up were rebuffed. I had to think about what that meant. And what I concluded to some degree, was that President Chavez had achieved, eventually, much of what he wanted to achieve by articulating that overture to me, by having it reported, right? And actually, I'm not being flip about that. The important thing is to understand that he was looking to cultivate the notion that he was being reasonable, but that we were the obstacles to progress. Ultimately, as some of you know, I was expelled. Presumably, at least as President Chavez insisted in his public speech, in solidarity with a decision made by Evo Morales with respect to the American ambassador in Bolivia. Some months later, I returned. This was a most curious thing. Was I or was I not responsible for acts or activities that were inconsistent with my status as a diplomat? Apparently not, or he could not possibly have welcomed me back into the country. Right? So it's this. I come back to my earlier point. Anti-Americanism was a feature of President Chavez's dialogue with the public, especially the regional public, but also with the Venezuelan public, and this clearly limits what the United States can do, certainly unilaterally. And I think that it is important going forward that the United States commit to working with our partners in the hemisphere in support of democracy and human rights. And there's real work to be done, and happily, we are at a moment in the hemisphere at which there is a lot of interest in addressing the now undeniable difficulties facing the Bolivarian Republic. There is no consensus, at least yet, on how we should address those difficulties. But there is now a conversation, there are actually multiple conversations going on, which recognize that something may well have to be done on behalf of the Venezuelan people, whether it is humanitarian relief or other measures taken to encourage a change in the policy direction, or the holding of the recall referendum. There's a conversation. Is it necessary? I think many people now believe that it is. What should be done? There's no consensus on that yet.
Yeah, these are good points. Michael, I'm going to go to you in just a second, but before I do, just to alert all of you that after this, we'll be able to go to you for the questions and comments you might have as well. We'll be happy to entertain those. But Michael, look, there's just so much on the table. What I would like to do is follow up in terms of Patrick's outstanding comments to ask you to extend this a little bit further, right? So he mentioned in his first intervention, that's a great State Department word, intervention, right? Interlocutor is the other great word that we always used to use. But in the context of the conversation right now, he mentioned the OAS effort this week. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
But I'd also like to give some insight, if you could, into the bilateral discussion that's going on right now in Caracas. A senior U.S. State Department official is in Caracas, allegedly to sit down with President Maduro. I say allegedly because the scenario you just painted is precisely the scenario, the reason why many people don't give a whole lot of stock to whether or not this initiative ongoing right now could in fact be successful, because they think maybe the U.S. is getting played again. I don't know I'm just the moderator, right? I'm going to ask somebody else his opinion on it. Michael, what do you think?
Well, without fully going to bat for the administration, let me try and do my best back of the envelope explanation of why this may be a constructive attempt on the part of the Obama administration and the State Department to send the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Tom Shannon, to Caracas today. First, this visit, sort of crisis diplomacy, takes place in the recent context of Secretary of State Kerry sitting down with Venezuela's Foreign Minister, Delcy Rodriguez, last week in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, at the Organization of American States annual meeting. And there was an important photo op from that at that meeting. And I think what the photo op said to me was two things. One, that the administration is sort of being consistent with its policy globally, which is that it's willing to sit down with adversaries so long as it thinks that it can get something from these conversations with adversaries. And second, I think that it's also a message to the Venezuelan people. The United States government is talking with the Castro brothers and the Cuban people. The Santos government in Colombia is speaking with the FARC and potentially about to strike a deal. So eventually, Venezuela, a highly polarized place, especially at the level of political elites on both sides, is going to have to sit down with each other. And I think that's part of the message being sent in that photo op in one way or another. Now, the specific sort of diplomacy, what might be at play here? First of all, it seems to me that there may be some sort of interest on the part of the State Department to try and diffuse the issue Ambassador Duddy was just speaking about, which is anti-Americanism. That is to say, theoretically, it could be harder to make the case that there is sort of U.S. meddling if a high-level State Department official is sitting down on a regular basis publicly with members of the Maduro government. We also heard a counterpoint to that, with regards to what happened with Ambassador Duddy's case. Also, it's possible that the U.S. government feels as though it has a little bit more leverage this year. Last year, Shannon did this similar sort of back and forth set of trips to Caracas and also to Haiti. And this time, the administration has renewed its authority to sanction Venezuelan government officials, not only, by the way, for human rights, but also for corruption. It hasn't, in fact, officially or publicly sanctioned any of those officials this year. But there are a number of open investigations taking place in U.S. courts, and there are also a number of sealed briefs that have been reported by the Wall Street Journal and other places. So it seems to me that there's a possibility that the U.S. feels as though it has a few more levers this year than it does in the past. Third, I think that considering the intensity of the crisis and the fact that Venezuela could fall off the cliff, the administration, from a practical point of view, may simply be interested in having a more direct, high-level line of communication with the Maduro government. And then last, as has been alluded to a number of times in the remarks so far, it's a very different moment in the region. In the past, there have been some talks between the Venezuelan government and the opposition. I wouldn't call them dialogue, I would just call them talks. They didn't go anywhere. They were facilitated to some degree by UNASUR, which is a South American union, and to some extent the Vatican and other groups. And the US was involved, but it had to play a backseat role. There was no other option at that time. Today, the United States government can actually step to the fore in the context of sharing the process with others at the table, but it can be at the dais. Today, 2 years ago, that would not have been possible with the Kirchners in power in Argentina and the Rousseff government in Brazil. It was a much different moment in Latin America. So it's time, theoretically, I think it's really time for the U.S. to step back into the game in South America, in a more prominent position. I think it's still going to want to do things in a multilateral fashion, but that's, I think, what's going on as far as potential thinking within the administration. And the OAS, I think that Secretary General Almagro deserves a ton of credit for his admirable efforts to be a watchdog for democracy on Venezuela. And I think he knew coming into his tenure in this position that he either had to try and get out in front of the Venezuela issue or he was going to be eaten up by the Venezuela issue. That's essentially what happened to his predecessor, Secretary General Insulza, who's from Chile. And in a sense, that dichotomous choice forced Almagro's hand in one way or another. Now, there have been some consequences, I think, to that decision, because essentially it means that Almagro, as I read it, is no longer really the judge of this process. He's really the prosecutor. He's the one leading the charge against the Venezuelan government. Now, that has implications for the legitimacy of some of the things he's saying, because it seems as though he has an agenda, and he in fact may, and that agenda may be legitimate. But it has caused some problems with other member states of the Organization of American States. Today at the OAS, former Spanish Premier Zapatero offered some remarks about an initial round of talks sponsored by the Maduro government to try and get the opposition to sit down at the negotiating table. And that was a session initiated by the Venezuelan government. And on Thursday, there is supposed to be another special session in which Secretary General Almagro will in fact try and activate the Inter-American Democratic Charter. But in the meantime, a number of other initiatives have sort of come up between these two that have sort of worked out to, in a sense, sort of thread the needle, if you will. So for example, on June 15th at the Santo Domingo meeting, 15 member states of the Organization of American States issued a statement essentially calling for a combination of dialogue with teeth, or a more inclusive and respectful dialogue, and respect for the democratic process. And the 15 countries that signed that included really most of the big players in the hemisphere. And I think that that tells you that there really isn't too much of an appetite out there for invoking the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And I think that comes back to the fact that at the forefront of most people's thinking today when it comes to Venezuela is stability in some way. And unfortunately, that there's not enough time and bandwidth to do everything at the same time. So that may mean that issues of democracy promotion may take, to some extent, a second seat. Now, in the broader picture, when you look at all this, it's quite confusing. And the way I've been trying to describe it is though it seems to me as though there's almost sort of a too many cooks in the kitchen kind of problem when it comes to Venezuela, because we've got these three ex-presidents working at, from the perspective of the Venezuelan government. UNASUR Secretary General wants to do something. Almagro wants to do something. Kerry wants to do something at the State Department. So it's a very complicated situation, and there's no chef. There's no one setting the table right now and really running the show yet. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Patrick, a quick point.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, the Venezuelan foreign minister recently said, in rebuffing, Secretary Kerry, that Venezuelans would settle Venezuela's problems. What I would suggest is that what the United States is maintaining is good. There is a mechanism for that, or a number of mechanisms, one of which is the recall referendum. And I think that the U.S. government wants to make sure, and this is part of the thinking behind the renewal of talks, that the focus be very specifically on what can be done in Venezuela between and among Venezuelans, and by at least beginning a new round of talks between the United States and Venezuela. To some degree, the United States can remove from the table this notion that we are in some sort of a standoff and are uniquely responsible for Venezuela's problems. The United States, I would note for you, remains Venezuela's largest trading partner. And notwithstanding the fact that I was expelled, brought back, they then withdrew agrément for my named successor and expelled a whole series of other diplomats, we never closed our embassy. We continued to do business, and we never closed our embassy. So we are still at the very, we are still a cornerstone of their economic policy. And I think that the United States is committed right now to trying to help the region address what is seen here as not just a festering problem, but one that threatens to become calamitous. And as I say, I think there are mechanisms. The hemisphere is trying to figure out how best to encourage Venezuela to embrace those mechanisms and for the government to fulfill its own responsibility to uphold its constitution.
This is what I've always thought in the circumstances as the supreme irony. I mean, the United States has been held up, as you both said, as kind of the bogeyman, the alleged cause of all the problems, et cetera, et cetera. We remain Venezuela's top customer of petroleum, refiner of their products, all kinds of things. And this kind of dual-headed reality, or that's not the right way to put it, but it's always seemed just bizarre to me, how, and I understand the politics behind it, but it's one of the, those of you who know your Latin American literature might recognize this as a real-time example of magical realism. Huh? Well, let's go to all of you for your comments, questions, ideas. We promised that we would give you a little bit of time. We don't have a lot of time, but we did start late, so if you could go to the microphone, identify yourself by name, and if you're representing an organization, that would be appreciated. If the question goes to one of the specific panelists, feel free to so direct. We will take a round of 3 questions, if there are 3, and then ask the panelists to respond. Thanks very much.
All right, hello, check. Okay. My name is Scott Charney, and I'm not representing any particular organization. I guess you already answered more or less the questions of why Venezuela melted down the way that the other parts of the pink tide really did not at all. But what there's another contrast I'd like to pose, and that's with a government that was more authoritarian, far more eccentric, potentially more kleptocratic, et cetera, and yet was sowing the oil, SOW, to great success and quite a bit of prosperity, and that's pre-war Libya, the highest human development index on the African continent. So what explains the difference there?
Okay, thank you. And we'll take the second question.
Hi, my name is Riley Zecca, and I'm representing the Young Professionals in International Affairs. I have a 2-part question, one economic and one political. First, economically, how do you think that the multi-tiered exchange system contributed to their economic difficulties? And if it was done away with, how would it alleviate some of it? And secondly, from what I can gather from the news articles I read, the MUD coalition seems to be solely focused on the ouster of Maduro. So can you comment on what their domestic policies would be to actually help the Venezuelan people?
Yeah, those are all good questions. Is there a third person? If not, we'll take those 2. Oh, yes.
Hi, my name is Casey Wexler. I'm here representing the World Affairs Council, and I would like to ask a question about the recent sharp rise in violent crime in Venezuela. It's among the highest in the world of the country in peacetime, and I was wondering, how can Venezuela alleviate this sharp rise in violent crime?
Yeah, very good. We all talk about the humanitarian crisis, and we put that in the context of food shortages and medical, disaster, and we oftentimes forget to talk about the spiking crime, the ability just to walk around the street without getting mugged. Michael, why don't we start with you? We've got 4 disparate questions out there, so I'm not quite sure which one you want to start with, but maybe we can package a couple of these together. Look, the mood is the opposition, and I think it's an interesting question that's been posed. What's their agenda? Is their agenda simply to get the Chavistas out of power and then decide, later on what to do, number one? And how does that square with some of the very real problems that are facing common Venezuelan citizens today, like the crime problem? I mean, whoever's in power, this is not going to change in 24 hours.
Yeah, very good set of questions. Starting with the recent elections, to try and get a sense of what the opposition's agenda entails, one basically, sort of runs into the situation of, I don't know. There's a big question mark really at the end of that thought, because in the legislative elections in 2015, the truth is that the opposition had a big problem with campaign financing. In other words, it didn't have much money. Secondarily, the economic crisis was the campaign. In other words, there wasn't much to campaign on because the failure was quite evident. And the opposition's main objective was simply communicating to the broader public that it believed in an electoral path to power, and that there was still something meaningful about the voting process in Venezuela. That was a very minimalist but effective campaign in the context of a severe economic crisis. It had the cost of delaying a debate about their agenda. That may be to some extent to their interest, because the Mesa de Unidad Democrática, the MUD, is an extremely heterogeneous political coalition. Somewhere between 20 and 30 parties, depending on whether or not one party's been eaten up by the other this week or that week. It's not going to be easy to put these guys all together. The opposition did have a sort of 100 solutions in the first 100 days sort of program. And the best program they really had, I think, was actually in the 2010 parliamentary elections, and likewise Capriles' campaign in 2012, which was somewhat a weak-kneed sort of Chavista platform because of the specific context at the time, also give you some insight. But what do we mean? Well, the biggest question is, would a future opposition government, what would they do with the oil question? How would they get that thing going again? And it's going to be very difficult for them in the short term to make any changes that involve rethinking a model of economic development extremely dependent on oil. They're going to be stuck in a position where they're going to have to probably focus on trying to get production up to a very high level. And that's probably going to involve increasing their dependency on oil. The best mechanism they have against that, so to speak, a defense mechanism, is to rely less on a state-based model and to use more foreign multinationals in that regard. But when you look at the opposition's campaign over the years, you see that they've learned quite a bit about Chavismo. They came to eventually embrace some of the local governance issues and popular participation programs. Those seem likely to stay. I think that there are likely to be efforts to try and, if you will, institutionalize the social assistance programs known as missions. They're likely to have a different title because the relationship with Cuba is probably going to have to change under a new government. But I think that there's a sense in which sort of Chavez's shift to the left of Venezuelan politics and his entire style will have something of a legacy effect on how any future opposition government runs the country. Did you want me to do all three, or just
no, not necessarily,
okay,
because I've got
But one quick point on the Chavez legacy question. In my consulting world, I work for a Venezuelan polling firm called the Venebarometro. And in April, we actually asked a question trying to get some purchase on to what extent this current crisis is affecting Chavez's legacy. And surprisingly, 52% of those surveyed argued or agreed with the statement that Chavez did things poorly or not well for the country, and that his model should be thrown away or discarded. Included in that 52% was 49% of independents in the poll. So that was a surprising number for us. Someone recently asked me at a cocktail party whether or not I thought that Hugo Chavez would become the Che Guevara of our children's generation. I actually think that there's a good chance he doesn't become the Che Guevara of our generation. He's not going to be the man on the T-shirt, the cool sort of figure. I mean, history never repeats itself, but I don't see the same sort of memorializing of this figure of struggle the same way that happened with Che in the 20th century.
Patrick, I want to come to you in terms of the exchange rate and the corruption and some of those issues, and also the Libya question, and to the extent you might have thoughts on that. But Michael, one of the issues as you're talking that occurs to me in terms of issues that will face the next government, whoever they are, is the fact that they will have to deal with an economy that in some ways, as you said, has already been programmed to go in a certain direction, and it's going to be really difficult to reprogram it, specifically because much of the only commodity that Venezuela produces, oil, which we've been talking about, has already been pre-sold to China. Right? So, I mean, China has given the money up front. That money has been spent. It's not there anymore. Right. But the oil has not yet been delivered. And that's, over 20, 30, 50 years, whatever the terms are for each particular agreement. So, a government that comes in that has to find a way to pay down debt, that has to find a way to re-engineer an economy that, at some level, it's kind of like in our own budget process, the required expenses that we have for some of the programs that we have. I mean, the discretionary spending in the U.S. budget is very, very limited. In some ways, that's what the Venezuelans will face, no?
3 quick thoughts. One, although the Maduro government has not made a policy adjustment, it has made a major change in the level of imports coming into the country. This year, it's expected that they will import less than 20 billion in goods, and last year it was around 37 billion. This is a major shock to their system in terms of what we're seeing on the street.
And just to add, and this is partially what explains the problems of acute scarcity.
But it's also potentially going to balance the fiscal books a little bit, to some extent. There's also a sort of implicit process of dealing with the exchange rate going on right now. The government's not calling it a devaluation, but there's one de facto taking place. But on the big question of the structural relationship between Venezuela and China, I think that's likely to remain in place. My understanding is that not just because the Financial Times said so the other day, but the Venezuelan opposition has established a relationship with the Chinese government for a number of years now. That's been a well-known piece of information in Caracas for a long time. I don't think that's going to change in the context of a different government. But I don't think that government is going to treat China like the IMF, right? They're going to be more willing to work with the IMF, not only for technical assistance on how to make some of these changes on the policy front, but also to look for a real package. And I think that those are all in play. But I don't think that we're going to see on the part of a new government in Venezuela, if it's an opposition government rather than a coalition one, to make a radical 180-degree shift. I don't see that happening.
Thanks. Patrick, your thoughts?
A couple of things. First, it's important to note that before you can have an IMF program, the government has to ask for it. Right. So there won't be an IMF program until either the current government, highly unlikely, or some future government asks for it. My sense of where the economy is now is that Venezuela is going to need help, and urgently. Right? The problem with exchange rates, imports, are also related to price controls, which they have attempted to maintain now for a decade. While also literally turning over management of the ports to various government entities, aided and embedded and often staffed apparently by Cubans. They're going to need to proceed on several fronts more or less simultaneously to right the economic ship. It's going to involve trying to unify exchange rates, get their arms around the problem of money supply. They've been pouring billions and billions and billions of dollars into the economy, essentially printing money in order to pay for things. This has caused the parallel rate to spike, which was going down ever so slightly, to spike. The country needs to get the private sector involved again, but it's probably going to require a process that is carefully choreographed, because the damage to the private sector over the last decade, which was intentional. I mean, the government announced that their goal was the complete transformation of their economic system in a document I think called the Plan Bolívar 2008 a 2013, literally a 5-year plan to completely transform the economy. And in that plan, if I'm not mistaken, the private sector was at one point referred to as a transitory necessity. It's worth noting that places like Brazil, which is having its troubles at the moment, but nevertheless had over a period of time, without the enormous windfall that the spike in global oil prices represented for Venezuela, managed to move an immense number of people into the middle class. Neither President Lula nor President Joseph attempted to undermine the private sector. They certainly wanted to have ambitious social programs, but their vision of a successful future didn't include the dissolution of the private sector, right? So a lot has happened on purpose in Venezuela, and it's going to take very careful choreography to bring it back. But they need to bring back not only their domestic private sector, but also restore confidence in the really extraordinary array of foreign companies that had long been active in the economy. Some of us have noted in the paper recently that Schlumberger and other important oil services companies have announced that they're reducing operations in Venezuela. This is a very, very bad piece of news for Venezuela because they're not able to either cash out their now nearly worthless bolivares or repatriate profits in any timely way. Lufthansa recently suspended flights. A whole series of other major companies have been abandoning ship. Venezuela is going to need help, and they're going to somehow have to arrive at the point where they understand that a mission to assist the country is not necessarily something they can avoid. My own sense is that to some degree, at the moment, they think that it would constitute a tacit admission of the failure of their model. Their model has failed, right? Their model has failed. But more urgent than somehow, an essentially pointless defense of the model is the fact that there's real suffering in Venezuela right now.
Well, we are at time, regrettably. I don't know if there's one final burning question. I think there was a gentleman who there was one in the back. That's the one, yeah. Okay, well, let's take a couple then. If you all are able to do it.
Or could you answer my Libya question?
Yeah, I don't feel entirely competent to answer that, but what I can tell you is that the level of dependence on oil in Venezuela, curiously, even though it was recognized and the company was, the national oil company was relentlessly milked for both funds and management expertise, not much was done in the way of capital investment in the sector. And so, again, despite the fact that oil prices were soaring, Venezuela never managed to ratchet up production. And now they find themselves with, oil, trading at, $40 or $50 a barrel instead of 120, with production levels that are really substantially below where they were, and a part of their production already promised to amortize the debt they owe to China. And they've even engaged more recently in discussions with India because they owe a tremendous amount of money to India for medicines. And again, I remember during my tenure as ambassador, people from the pharmaceutical industry coming in and telling me, look, ambassador, we're not going to be able to continue indefinitely supplying the country if we don't get paid, right? But this has been going on for a long time.
Let's take the final two questions back here at the microphone, please.
All right. Look, my name is Jim French, WAC member. I've always been amazed that Venezuela is a subtropical climate. Why do they have trouble growing their own food? Why should a country like that have to import food?
Okay, thank you. And let's take the second question at the same time.
I'm John Helgerson. I live in Grenada, about 90 miles off the coast of Venezuela. Since Chavez came to power, we've noticed an increase in refugees, although they tended to be affluent Venezuelans who had a foot in each camp, and we saw an increase in smuggling and drug running. More recently, the smuggling has morphed in very recently into piracy of yachts and small fishing boats. And I was told in a phone conversation the other night that the first of the smugglers were now bringing in refugees. Is there any movement afoot to do any planning about a possible refugee crisis?
Patrick, let's start with you.
Well, I can't speak to the issue of what planning might be going on, but in point of fact, there is a concern that Venezuela is becoming essentially a lawless place. There are armed groups in many of the poor ghettos. They're frequently known as colectivos. They are armed but organized. And the government has periodically, President Maduro himself, but earlier President Chavez and his brother, they've all at various times said to the Venezuelan public that if we were to lose an election somehow, we would take our fight into the streets. Right? There was a point when President Chavez's cancer was first announced, when his brother actually said publicly to the party members, not to the military, to the party members, you need to be prepared to defend the revolution by force of arms. So there is a sense that Venezuela is increasingly an armed camp, and while the government and its supporters have a monopoly on force, there are armed elements within the country which, at least to this point, support Chavismo and Chavez, which are outside the uniformed services. Right? How large they are, it's very hard to tell. But President Chavez also established a militia, and that militia is, once again, it's not one of the armed forces. It's a different sort of phenomenon. So there are armed groups. We've seen as the economy has declined. If you track undocumented or illicit flights through Venezuela, indications that drug trafficking has become very, very significant since President Chavez ended effective cooperation with the DEA. And there are also, there's a proliferation of versions of various people looking for a better life elsewhere. Once again, we touched only glancingly on the character of life right now in many Venezuelan cities. But according to many analysts, Caracas is now the single most violent city in the world among countries not at war. Right? It is not uncommon for there to be 2 or 3 dozen murders over any given weekend. And again, as one of my colleagues, former colleagues in the room knows, I remember coming back to post after having been gone for some months after my expulsion, and reading in the papers that on a particular 3-day weekend there had been 40-odd murders. I said to one of my staff, oh my goodness, this isn't just something that should be reported to Washington through the usual sort of channel for the regional security officer, just sort of atmospherics. When you have that many murders, it's political, meaning it is politically significant, not that they were politically inspired. And my team at the time said, well, yeah, we'll report it if you want us to, Ambassador, but it's not news. It's happening almost every weekend. And you've just been gone for a while and have become more sensitive to it. But there is a deep concern in many quarters because of this combination of scarcity, an increasingly authoritarian trend within the government, the sense that the elected representatives of the people, they won 2/3 of the seats in the legislature, but seem to be rebuffed at every turn by the Chavista established courts. That life in Venezuela has just become too difficult, and some people are leaving. How many, it's hard to say.
Michael, we'll give the last word to you. You've lived in Venezuela. Why can't they grow their own food?
Well, there at least are mango trees that do reward you with mangoes on some streets in Caracas, but they are also dangerous objects. You have to watch out in case they hit you on the head. Venezuela has a long-term problem that has basically defied the thinking of most economists up until a number of people began to play with a hypothesis known as the paradox of plenty, which essentially boils down to the problem of how you make a transition to industrialization and some degree of agricultural development once you become a petroleum-based economy. And it's been very difficult, not only for Venezuela. In the specific context of this regional sort of market, it's important to recognize that Colombia and Venezuela produce a number of the same products, but Colombia doesn't have oil. As a result, it's always been easier to export. For example, it hasn't had an overvalued currency and things like that. And Venezuela really tried to skip agricultural development and move straight to industrialization during the oil boom in the 1970s. They've nonetheless had some agricultural sectors that were somewhat competitive, in particular in coffee, chocolate, rum, and some other products, and some domestic production. And it's going to be very difficult to return to some level of domestic consumption on those fronts. That's the long and the short of it. Read Terry Carl's book, Paradox of Plenty. It's truly a pleasure, and it's also mind-boggling and can drive you a bit crazy since it doesn't make any sense. But one quick point on the HDI thing. I just want to mention that I'm no Libya expert, but it is important to recognize that at one point Venezuela actually was ranked very high also on HDI index by the United Nations. And so that may just be a flash in the pan. It may not be something that's sustainable. So in the Venezuelan context, there was a point in which HDI was doing quite well. And just to close on the question of the problems with really runaway organized crime and violence and this sort of lawlessness in the country, I've been affected by it living in the country or moving throughout the country. Almost all Venezuelans have. It's not something that really anyone should sort of play the violin about. It's something that people have been living with for a long time in the country. And the scary thing, just at a political level, is the possibility that people could just become sort of accustomed to it at some level, as in fact Ambassador Duddy was alluding to in terms of the change in perceptions about these issues. I think, though, that if there is another issue that we could add to the international community's agenda, it is trying to bring some useful lessons to the Venezuelan context about making cities safer around the world. Previous cities that have had major problems with violence, like Medellin, Mexico is going through a very serious problem right now, obviously, with violence. But there needs to be some real thinking done about how to help Venezuela deal with this problem during this government and in any future government, because it's a problem that really deteriorates the quality of life in Venezuela for all people.
Well, and I think on that note, we can all agree that the situation bears further watching, further conversation. I hope the World Affairs Council will continue to follow these issues. Speaking for myself, I've had a great time. This has been a lot of fun. Hope I also speak for the panelists. They've done a terrific job. Would you please join me in thanking the panelists for their time?
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.